Hey there, and welcome to History in Twilight. Tonight, I want to tell you something that might shake everything you thought you knew about history. Something your textbooks probably got wrong. We've all heard the story. Rome fell in 476 AD. Barbarians sacked the city. The empire crumbled. The Dark Ages began. The end. Except that's not what happened. Not really. Because while Rome burned in the west, another Rome, a greater Rome, was just getting started in the east. For over 1,000 years, this empire stood as the richest, most powerful, and most sophisticated civilization on Earth. It preserved everything the ancient world had created. It held back invasion after invasion. And when it finally fell, it gave birth to the Renaissance itself. This is the story of the Byzantine Empire, the empire history forgot. So before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. I'm always curious to know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you right now, so drop that in the comments below. Now, settle in, dim the lights, let the noise of the modern world fade away, and let us travel back to a time of golden domes, sacred emperors, and walls that defied every army on Earth. This is the story of Rome's other half, the half that survived. Chapter 1: The City That Should Never Have Been. In the year 324 AD, the Roman Emperor Constantine stood on a windswept peninsula where Europe meets Asia. Around him stretched nothing but a small, decaying Greek town called Byzantium. It was unremarkable. It was poor. It had no grand monuments, no legendary history. But Constantine saw something no one else did. He saw the future. This narrow strip of land, this forgotten corner of the empire, sat at the crossroads of the world. To the west lay Europe. To the east, Asia. To the north, the Black Sea and the riches of the steppes. To the south, the Mediterranean and the wealth of Egypt. And protecting it all was geography itself. The site was surrounded on three sides by water. The Golden Horn, a deep natural harbour, curved along the northern shore. The Sea of Marmara guarded the south. The Bosphorus Strait, that legendary ribbon of water connecting two seas and two continents, ran along the eastern edge. Any enemy who wanted to take this city would have to cross water, would have to breach walls, would have to fight uphill against a fortress built by the gods themselves. Constantine made his decision. He would move the capital of the entire Roman Empire here. He would build a new Rome, greater than the old, a city that would stand for 1,000 years. They said he was mad. They were wrong. Construction began immediately. Thousands of workers, architects, and engineers descended on the site. Constantine didn't just want a city. He wanted a statement. A declaration that Rome had evolved, transformed, become something new. The old Byzantium was torn down. In its place rose something extraordinary. Massive walls were erected, encircling the peninsula in a ring of stone and power. Inside, Constantine laid out a city on the Roman model. Wide avenues, paved with marble. Public squares surrounded by columns. Aqueducts bringing fresh water from distant mountains. But this was not simply Rome rebuilt. This was Rome reimagined. At the heart of the city, Constantine constructed the Hippodrome, a massive stadium that could hold 100,000 spectators. Chariot races here would become the beating heart of public life, where emperors connected with their people and politics played out in screaming crowds. Next to it rose the Great Palace, a sprawling complex of halls, churches, gardens, and throne rooms that stretched down toward the sea. This wasn't just a residence. It was a sacred space, where the emperor lived as God's representative on earth. And then there were the churches. Constantine was the first Christian emperor, and he intended his new capital to reflect that faith. The Church of the Holy Apostles was built to house his own tomb, placing him symbolically among Christ's disciples. The original Hagia Sophia, Church of Holy Wisdom, rose nearby, though it was nothing yet compared to what would come later. But Constantine didn't just build with stone. He built with memory. He ordered that treasures from across the empire be brought to his new city. Statues from Athens, obelisks from Egypt, the serpent column from Delphi, a bronze monument older than Rome itself. Art that had stood for centuries in the old imperial centres was uprooted and transported east. The message was clear. This was not a second Rome. This was the new Rome, the only Rome that mattered. On May 11th, 330, the city was officially dedicated. Constantine named it Nova Roma, New Rome. But the world had another name for it. They called it Constantinople, Constantine's city. The old Rome, the Rome of the Caesars, was already fading. Barbarian tribes pressed against its borders. Political chaos tore it from within. The West was dying. But here, on this peninsula between two worlds, a new empire was born. Constantinople became an instant magnet for wealth, talent, and ambition. Merchants from India and China brought silk, spices, and precious stones to its docks. Scholars from Alexandria brought books and learning. Bishops and monks brought theology and devotion. The population exploded. Within decades, hundreds of thousands of people crowded into its streets, speaking Greek, Latin, Aramaic, Armenian, and a dozen other tongues. It was the most cosmopolitan city on earth, and it was the most defended. The natural harbour of the Golden Horn was blocked by a massive chain that could be raised to prevent enemy ships from entering. Watchtowers lined the coast. Garrison troops drilled constantly. The city was not just beautiful, it was a fortress. By the time Constantine died in 337, his vision had become reality. Constantinople was not just the capital of the Roman Empire, it was the centre of the world. But here's what makes this story so extraordinary. Rome itself, the old eternal city, continued to decline. In 410, the Visigoths sacked it. In 455, the Vandals did the same. By 476, when the last Western Roman emperor was deposed, Rome was a shadow of its former self. And yet Constantinople stood untouched, unconquered, thriving. While the West collapsed into chaos, the East remained stable, wealthy, and powerful. The Roman Empire hadn't fallen, it had simply moved. For the next 1,000 years, this city would be the jewel of the world. It would survive sieges, plagues, invasions, and betrayals. It would preserve the knowledge of the ancient world and pass it on to the future. It would be a beacon of art, faith, and civilization in an age of darkness. This was the city that should never have been, built on ambition, geography, and faith. A city that outlasted empires, armies, and time itself. And every story of Byzantium begins here, on this narrow peninsula, with one man's impossible vision. Chapter 2. When Rome fell, but didn't. The year 476 AD is burned into every history textbook. It's the year Rome fell, the year the empire ended, the year the ancient world died and the medieval world was born, except that in Constantinople, no one noticed. In the West, a barbarian chieftain named Odoacer had just deposed the last Roman emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus. The Western imperial throne, the seat of the Caesars, was empty. The Senate sent the imperial regalia, the crown and purple robes, east to Constantinople as a gesture of surrender. There was no longer a Roman Empire in the West. But the people in Constantinople didn't see it as the end of Rome. They saw it as a minor administrative adjustment, because to them, the empire had never been divided. There was only one Rome, one emperor, one eternal state blessed by God. And that empire was ruled from Constantinople. The so-called fall of Rome was a Western problem, a distant tragedy. But the real Rome, the living, breathing continuation of Augustus and Constantine, carried on without interruption. This is one of history's greatest misunderstandings. We call them Byzantines, a name they never used for themselves. They called themselves Romans, Romaioi in Greek. Every emperor, from Constantine to the very last one in 1453, claimed the title of Roman emperor. Their laws were Roman. Their administration was Roman. Their identity was Roman. The empire didn't fall in 476. It just lost some territory. For the next few decades, Constantinople focused on survival and consolidation. The West was a mess of barbarian kingdoms, Ostrogoths in Italy, Visigoths in Spain, Franks in Gaul. They all claimed to rule in the name of the Roman Empire, but it was fiction. The Eastern emperors watched and waited. They were patient. They were calculating. And they believed, with absolute certainty, that one day they would reclaim what had been lost. That day came in 527, when a man named Justinian ascended the throne. Justinian was not born to rule. He was the nephew of the previous emperor, a peasant who had clawed his way to power. Justinian himself grew up speaking Latin, rare in a Greek-speaking court, and he never lost his provincial accent. But what he lacked in pedigree, he made up for in ambition. He had a vision, simple and audacious. He would restore the Roman Empire to its ancient glory. He would reconquer the West. He would reunite the Mediterranean under one emperor, one law, one faith. They called him the Emperor who never sleeps. He worked obsessively, late into the night, drafting laws, planning campaigns, micromanaging every detail of his empire. His wife, Theodora, a former actress and dancer who had risen from poverty to become empress, was equally formidable. Together, they were unstoppable. Justinian's first act was to secure his legal legacy. He ordered a complete codification of Roman law, gathering centuries of legal texts, imperial edicts, and judicial opinions into a single unified system. The result was the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. This wasn't just a legal project, it was a declaration. Roman law, refined and perfected, would govern not just the present empire, but all the territories he intended to reconquer. The Code of Justinian would become the foundation of legal systems across Europe for the next 1,000 years. But law was only the beginning. Justinian wanted glory, and glory meant conquest. In 533, he launched his first campaign. The target was North Africa, controlled by the Vandals, the same barbarians who had sacked Rome in 455. To lead the campaign, Justinian chose his greatest general, a man named Belisarius. Belisarius was a military genius. Young, charismatic, and utterly loyal, he had already proven himself in wars against Persia. Now, with a relatively small army of 15,000 men, he sailed west to challenge an entire kingdom. The campaign was shockingly swift. Within months, Belisarius had defeated the Vandal armies, captured their king, and reclaimed North Africa for Rome. The speed of the victory stunned the world. Constantinople erupted in celebration. The unthinkable had happened. Roman legions were marching in the west again. Justinian didn't stop. Next came Italy. Italy, the heartland of the old empire, was controlled by the Ostrogoths. They had ruled for decades, maintaining a veneer of Roman administration while real power rested in barbarian hands. Justinian saw this as an insult. Italy belonged to Rome. In 535, Belisarius invaded. The Gothic War, as it came to be known, would drag on for nearly 20 years. It was brutal, destructive, and exhausting. Cities changed hands multiple times. Rome itself was besieged, liberated, besieged again. But in the end, Justinian's armies prevailed. By 554, Italy was back under imperial control. The dream of reconquest seemed real. Justinian also reclaimed parts of southern Spain. By the time he was finished, the Mediterranean was once again a Roman lake. The empire stretched from Mesopotamia to Gibraltar. On the map, it looked like the glory days had returned. But the reality was more complicated. The wars of reconquest had been ruinously expensive. The imperial treasury was drained. Italy, devastated by decades of fighting, was a shadow of its former self. North Africa was restless and difficult to hold, and the eastern frontier, where Persia loomed, demanded constant attention and resources. Justinian had restored the empire's borders, but he had also exhausted it. And then came the plague. In 541, a disease arrived in Constantinople from Egypt. It spread with terrifying speed. Historians estimate that it killed between a quarter and half of the empire's population. Entire neighborhoods were emptied, bodies piled in the streets. The disease struck rich and poor alike. Justinian himself fell ill. For days, he lay near death, while the empire held its breath. He survived, but the empire never fully recovered. The plague of Justinian, as it came to be known, was one of the deadliest pandemics in history. It weakened the army, devastated the economy, and shattered the dream of full reconquest. The territories Justinian had reclaimed would not last. Within decades of his death in 565, much of Italy was lost again, this time to the Lombards. North Africa remained imperial, but barely. The grand vision had crumbled. And yet, Justinian's legacy endured. Not in the lands he conquered, but in what he built. His legal code became the foundation of European law. His architectural masterpiece, the rebuilt Hagia Sophia, completed in 537, became the greatest church in Christendom, a monument to divine glory that still stands today. His vision of a unified Christian Roman Empire, though never fully realized, shaped the identity of Byzantium for the next 9 centuries. When Rome fell in the West, the story didn't end. It transformed. The empire became smaller, more Greek, more Christian. It became something new. It became Byzantine. But to the people who lived through it, there was no transformation, no ending, no new beginning. There was only Rome, eternal and unbroken, carrying on under God's protection. When the West fell, Rome didn't die. It simply moved east. And from Constantinople, it would endure for another 1,000 years. Chapter 3. The Walls That Laughed at Armies. There's a reason Constantinople survived for over 1,000 years, while every other great city of the ancient world fell to ruin. It wasn't luck. It wasn't divine intervention, though the Byzantines certainly believed God protected them. It was walls. Not just any walls. The greatest fortifications ever built by human hands. Walls so massive, so brilliantly designed, that for 8 centuries they made Constantinople essentially unconquerable. The story of these walls begins in the early 5th century, during the reign of Emperor Theodosius II. He was only a boy when he inherited the throne in 408, but his advisors understood that Constantinople needed better defences. The city had grown far beyond Constantine's original walls. New neighbourhoods sprawled outside the old boundaries, vulnerable and unprotected. In 413, construction began on a new defensive system. It would take decades to complete, employing thousands of workers, engineers, and architects. What they created was revolutionary. The Theodosian walls, as they came to be known, stretched over 4 miles across the entire width of the peninsula, cutting the city off from the mainland. But calling them walls is almost an insult to their complexity. This was a 3-layer defensive system, the most sophisticated military architecture the world had ever seen. The outermost defense was a moat, 60 feet wide and 20 feet deep. When filled with water, which it usually was, this moat created an impassable barrier. Any army attempting to assault the city would first have to cross this killing zone, while defenders rained arrows and stones down from above. Behind the moat rose the outer wall, a thick barrier studded with 96 towers. Each tower was carefully positioned to allow defenders to create overlapping fields of fire. No attacker could approach without being targeted from multiple directions simultaneously. Then came the peribolos, an open terrace 40 to 60 feet wide. This was the killing ground. Any enemy who somehow managed to cross the moat and scale the outer wall would find themselves trapped in this exposed space, with nowhere to hide. And finally, towering behind everything, stood the inner wall. 40 feet high and 15 feet thick, reinforced with 96 more towers that rose even higher. These towers were 6 stories tall, massive stone giants that dominated the landscape. The inner wall was the true masterpiece. Its thickness meant that siege weapons, catapults, battering rams couldn't damage it. Its height meant that scaling it was virtually impossible, and its towers provided perfect elevated platforms for defending the entire system. The walls didn't just protect the landward side. They also ran along the coast, protecting the harbours and waterfront. The Golden Horn, that crucial harbour on the northern side, had an additional defence, a massive chain that could be stretched across its entrance, preventing enemy ships from entering. This wasn't just a wall. It was a statement of permanence, a declaration that Constantinople would stand forever. And it almost did. Throughout the centuries, army after army crashed against these walls like waves against stone. And every time, the walls held. In 626, the Avars and Persians launched a coordinated siege, attacking from both land and sea with over 80,000 troops. They brought siege towers, catapults, and battering rams. They assaulted the walls for weeks. The walls laughed at them. The siege failed. In 674, the Arabs came. They had just conquered an empire stretching from Spain to Persia. They were the most powerful military force on earth. They besieged Constantinople for 4 years, launching assault after assault. The walls held, and the Arabs had no answer for another Byzantine secret: Greek fire. Greek fire was one of history's great mysteries. A liquid incendiary weapon that burned on water. It was sprayed from tubes mounted on Byzantine warships. The exact formula was a closely guarded state secret, known only to a handful of imperial chemists. Even today, we don't know precisely what it was made of. What we do know is that it was terrifying. Arab ships caught fire and couldn't be extinguished. The sea itself seemed to burn. Combined with the walls' impregnability on land, Greek fire made Constantinople untouchable. The Arab siege collapsed. Their fleet was destroyed. They never tried again. In 813, the Bulgarians came, led by their fierce Khan Krum. The Bulgarians had already defeated Byzantine armies in the field, killing an emperor in battle. Now, Krum brought his entire army to the walls of Constantinople, confident he could take the city. He couldn't. The walls were impervious to everything he tried. Frustrated, humiliated, Krum retreated. He died soon after, reportedly from a burst blood vessel brought on by his rage at failing to conquer the city. Again and again, the pattern repeated. Rus Vikings in 860, Arabs again in 717, Bulgarians in 924. Each time, the greatest armies of their age arrived at Constantinople expecting victory. Each time, they stared up at those towering walls and realized they had no chance. The psychological impact of the walls was almost as important as their physical strength. Every enemy who approached Constantinople and saw those triple barriers understood immediately that taking this city would be nearly impossible. Many sieges ended before they truly began, with attackers simply giving up and going home. The walls created a sense of invincibility within Constantinople itself. Citizens believed their city was blessed by God, protected by the Virgin Mary herself. And why wouldn't they? For centuries, no foreign army had ever breached those defenses. This confidence shaped Byzantine culture. While other medieval cities lived in constant fear of invasion, Constantinople's people could focus on art, learning, and commerce. The walls brought them something priceless: security in an age of chaos. Of course, the walls required constant maintenance. Stone cracked, earthquakes damaged towers. Every generation invested in repairs and reinforcements. Special imperial officials were appointed to oversee the wall's upkeep. It was considered one of the most important positions in the empire. The walls also defined the city's geography and psychology. Constantinople was an island of civilization surrounded by enemies. The walls were the barrier between order and chaos, between the Christian empire and the barbarian world beyond. Inside the walls, life could flourish. Churches rose, markets bustled, scholars debated. Outside the walls, armies came and went, empires rose and fell, but none of it mattered. The walls held. For 800 years, they were impregnable. But here's the tragedy. The greatest fortifications ever built, walls that had defeated Persians, Arabs, Bulgarians, and Vikings, walls that seemed eternal, had one fatal weakness. They could only protect against enemies from the outside. They couldn't protect against betrayal from within. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, Western European knights didn't breach the walls through military might. They were let in. Byzantine political chaos, a desperate emperor seeking allies, opened the gates, and once inside, the Crusaders discovered what everyone else had learned the hard way. The walls didn't just keep enemies out, they also trapped defenders in. But that catastrophe was still centuries away. For now, in the early medieval period, the Theodosian walls stood as humanity's greatest defensive achievement, a monument to engineering, strategy, and the Byzantine determination to survive. Every tower told a story. Every stone held a memory of an army that had failed. The walls weren't just fortifications. They were characters in the Byzantine story, silent guardians that shaped the empire's destiny. And as long as those walls stood, Constantinople stood, unconquerable, eternal. The city that should never have been, protected by walls that should never have held. Chapter 4. The Iconoclasm Wars, when faith became violence. Religion in Byzantium was never a private matter. It was politics, identity, and survival, all wrapped into one. The emperor ruled as God's representative on earth. Theological disputes could topple governments. And nowhere was this more evident than in one of the strangest, most violent conflicts in Christian history. For over 100 years, the Byzantine Empire tore itself apart over a single question. Should Christians be allowed to create and venerate images of Christ, Mary, and the saints? Or were such images idolatry, forbidden by God? This was the iconoclasm, the breaking of icons, and it nearly destroyed the empire from within. The controversy began in 726, during the reign of Emperor Leo III. Leo was a military man, a tough, pragmatic ruler who had saved Constantinople from an Arab siege. But he had a problem. The empire was shrinking. Arab armies had conquered Syria, Egypt, and North Africa. Slavic tribes were pushing into the Balkans. Everywhere Leo looked, enemies were winning. And Leo asked himself why. Why was God allowing the Christian empire to suffer while Muslims triumphed? He found his answer in the Old Testament. The second commandment explicitly forbids graven images. Yet Byzantine churches were filled with icons, painted images of holy figures that people kissed, prayed before, and venerated. To Leo, this looked like idolatry. Perhaps God was punishing the empire for this sin. The Muslims and Jews he fought against had no images in their worship. Their mosques and synagogues were decorated with geometric patterns and calligraphy, never human forms. They seemed to follow God's word more strictly. Maybe, Leo thought, that was why they were winning. In 726, Leo issued his first edict against icons. He ordered that religious images be removed from public display. Icons in churches were to be destroyed or plastered over. The production of new icons was forbidden. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Icons weren't just decorations. They were windows to heaven, sacred portals through which believers could connect with the divine. For centuries, Byzantine Christians had venerated these images. Soldiers carried small icons into battle for protection. Families kept them in their homes. Churches were covered floor to ceiling with painted and mosaic images of Christ, the Virgin, and the saints. Leo was asking people to destroy their connection to God. Riots erupted across the empire. In Constantinople, crowds attacked soldiers who tried to remove icons. In Greece, entire provinces rebelled. Monks, the most devoted defenders of icons, organized resistance. The Pope in Rome, already suspicious of Byzantine authority, condemned Leo's edict. This drove another wedge between Eastern and Western Christianity, a split that would eventually become permanent. But Leo wouldn't back down. He believed he was saving the empire's soul. What followed was persecution. Imperial troops raided monasteries, destroying icons, and arresting monks who refused to cooperate. Some monks were tortured, blinded, or exiled. Churches that resisted were forcibly stripped of their images. The empire descended into what can only be called a religious civil war, not with armies in open battle, but with violence, intimidation, and theological rage playing out in streets and churches across Byzantine territory. Leo's son, Constantine V, who became emperor in 741, was even more radical. He didn't just oppose icons, he despised them. He called icon venerators idolaters and heretics. He convened church councils that officially condemned icon worship. Constantine launched systematic campaigns against monasteries, the strongholds of icon veneration, he forced monks to marry, violating their vows, or parade through the hippodrome, holding women's hands while crowds mocked them. Monasteries were converted into barracks. Sacred art was burned. It was cultural destruction on a massive scale. But here's what makes this story so complex. The iconoclasts, the icon breakers, weren't just destructive fanatics. They had genuine theological arguments. They pointed to the Old Testament prohibition against graven images. They argued that depicting Christ in human form diminished his divine nature. They worried that uneducated peasants were worshipping the images themselves rather than what they represented. These were serious concerns debated by intelligent people. On the other side, the iconodules, the icon venerators, had equally strong arguments. They insisted that venerating icons wasn't idolatry. The honor paid to an image passed through to the person depicted. Icons were like windows. You didn't worship the window. You looked through it to see heaven. They also had a powerful emotional argument. For ordinary believers, icons provided comfort, connection, and hope. Taking them away felt like tearing out the heart of their faith. The conflict wasn't just about theology. It was about power. Emperors who supported iconoclasm were often military men, practical and focused on imperial authority. They saw monasteries as wealthy, land-owning institutions that didn't contribute to defense. Breaking their power through iconoclasm served political purposes. Monks, meanwhile, represented an alternative source of authority. They answered to God, not the emperor. By defending icons, they were also defending their independence. The struggle swung back and forth across generations. Some emperors were iconoclasts, others iconodules. Each transition brought purges, reversals of policy, and renewed persecution. The most dramatic reversal came in 780, when Empress Irene took power. Irene was a devoted icon venerator. In 787, she convened the Second Council of Nicaea, which officially restored the veneration of icons. Victory for the iconodules. Right. Not quite. After Irene's death, iconoclasm returned under new emperors. The persecution started again. More icons destroyed. More monks arrested. The final resolution didn't come until 843, when another empress, Theodora, permanently restored icon veneration. The date, the first Sunday of Lent in 843, is still celebrated in Orthodox Christianity as the triumph of orthodoxy. After more than 100 years, the war was over, but the damage was profound. Artistically, the iconoclasm was a catastrophe. Centuries of Byzantine art were destroyed. Mosaics were chiseled off walls. Paintings were burned. Manuscripts were defaced. The artistic legacy of early Christianity was gutted. We'll never know what masterpieces were lost. Religiously, the conflict deepened the split between Eastern and Western Christianity. The Pope had opposed iconoclasm from the beginning. Byzantine persecution of icon venerators horrified the West. Trust between Rome and Constantinople, already fragile, shattered further. Politically, the iconoclasm demonstrated the dangerous intersection of religion and state power in Byzantium. When emperors could dictate theology, faith became a weapon. The empire had turned on itself, wasting energy on internal conflicts, while external enemies pressed from all sides. And yet, in a strange way, the iconoclasm also defined Byzantine identity. The final triumph of icon veneration became a core part of Orthodox Christianity. Icons weren't just permitted, they became essential. The very thing the iconoclasts tried to destroy became the symbol of Byzantine faith. Today, when you enter an Orthodox church anywhere in the world, you're surrounded by icons, images of Christ, Mary, and the saints gaze down from every wall. Believers kiss them, light candles before them, pray through them. This tradition, this visual theology, survived because the Byzantine Empire fought over it for 117 years, because monks risked their lives to preserve it, because ordinary believers refused to let it die. The iconoclasm was one of history's strangest religious conflicts, a war fought not over land or power, but over images, over whether paint on wood could be sacred or was simply sin. It tore the empire apart. And in the end, the icons won. Chapter 5. The Greatest Heist in History. In the year 1204, Constantinople, the greatest city in Christendom, was sacked and looted, not by Muslims, not by pagans, but by fellow Christians. This is the story of the Fourth Crusade, and it's one of the most shameful episodes in medieval history. It's a tale of greed, manipulation, and betrayal that changed the course of empires. The Fourth Crusade was supposed to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. Pope Innocent III had called for a new holy war, and knights from France, Germany, and Italy answered the call. They gathered in Venice in 1202, ready to sail east and fight for Christ. But there was a problem. The Crusaders couldn't pay for their passage. Venice had built a massive fleet to transport the crusade, but the army that showed up was smaller than promised. The Crusaders owed the Venetians 85,000 silver marks, an enormous sum, and they couldn't pay. The Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, was a remarkable man. He was in his 90s and completely blind, yet his mind was sharp as ever, and he saw an opportunity. Dandolo proposed a deal. The Crusaders could pay off their debt through service. First, they would help Venice recapture the city of Zara on the Adriatic coast, a Christian city that had rebelled against Venetian control. The Crusaders were horrified. Attack a Christian city. This violated their sacred vows. The Pope explicitly forbade it, threatening excommunication, but they had no choice. They were trapped in Venice, in debt, with a massive army and nowhere to go. In November 1202, the fleet sailed to Zara. After a brief siege, the city fell. The Crusaders, who had taken vows to fight Muslims, had just conquered fellow Christians for Venetian commercial interests. It was supposed to be a one-time compromise. After Zara, they would sail to Egypt as planned. But then everything changed. A Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos appeared at the Crusader camp. He had been exiled from Constantinople and wanted his throne back. He made the Crusaders an incredible offer. "Help me take Constantinople," he said, "and I'll pay your entire debt to Venice. I'll fund your crusade to Egypt. I'll reunite the Orthodox and Catholic churches under Rome's authority. I'll give you everything you need." For the Crusader leaders, this was irresistible. They could solve their financial problems and strike a blow for Christian unity. For Dandolo and the Venetians, it was even better. Constantinople was Venice's greatest commercial rival. The chance to put a puppet emperor on the Byzantine throne was priceless. In the summer of 1203, the Crusader fleet arrived at Constantinople. The sight must have been terrifying. Hundreds of ships carrying 20,000 armed warriors appeared before the greatest city in the world. The Byzantines were stunned. A Christian army, flying the cross, was attacking the Christian capital. The Crusaders assaulted the walls and, in a fierce battle, managed to breach the defences. The reigning emperor fled. Prince Alexios was installed as co-emperor, just as promised. Victory. Success. The plan had worked. Except Alexios quickly discovered he couldn't keep his promises. The Byzantine treasury didn't have the money he'd pledged. When he tried to raise funds by taxing the people and confiscating church treasures, riots erupted. In January 1204, a palace coup overthrew and murdered Alexios. A new emperor, hostile to the Crusaders, took power. The Crusaders, camped outside Constantinople's walls, were furious. They'd been betrayed. They'd fought for a promise that would never be kept. And so they made a decision that would echo through history. They would take Constantinople by force. They would sack the city and divide its legendary wealth among themselves. In April 1204, the assault began. The Venetian fleet played a crucial role, using ships as floating siege towers to attack the sea walls. After desperate fighting, the defences were breached. The Crusaders poured into the wealthiest city in Christendom. What followed was 3 days of horror. The Crusaders, who had taken vows to protect Christianity, looted churches and monasteries. They tore golden ornaments from altars. They stole sacred relics, fragments of the true cross, the crown of thorns, bones of saints. Libraries were burned. Ancient Greek and Roman manuscripts, irreplaceable treasures of human knowledge, went up in flames. The Crusaders, most of them illiterate, had no idea what they were destroying. The great bronze horses that had stood in the hippodrome since ancient times were torn down and shipped to Venice, where they still stand today on St. Mark's Basilica. Palaces were stripped of artwork. Mosaics were chiseled from walls. Gold and silver were melted down for easier transport. Constantinople, which had survived every barbarian invasion for 8 centuries, was brutally violated by Christian warriors. Women were assaulted. Orthodox priests were murdered. The city that had preserved Christianity in the East for 1,000 years was treated like a conquered enemy capital. Even at the time, observers were horrified. Nicetas Choniates, a Byzantine historian who lived through the sack, wrote that the Muslim Saracens were merciful compared to these Christians who bore the cross. The haul was staggering. Contemporary accounts describe gold and silver and precious stones beyond counting. Every crusader became rich. The Venetians took an enormous share, including not just treasure, but strategic ports and islands throughout the Byzantine Empire. The Fourth Crusade never reached Jerusalem. It never fought a single Muslim. Instead, it destroyed the greatest Christian city in the world. After the sack, the Crusaders established the Latin Empire of Constantinople. A French knight became emperor. Catholic bishops replaced Orthodox patriarchs. Western feudal lords divided Byzantine territory among themselves. It was a disaster. The Latin Empire was weak, corrupt, and hated by the Greek population. It lasted only 57 years. In 1261, Byzantine forces recaptured Constantinople. The empire was restored, but it was a hollow victory. The city had been gutted. Its wealth was gone. Its population had scattered. The empire that had been the richest state in the world was now a shadow, holding little more than Constantinople itself and a few surrounding territories. The Byzantine Empire would limp on for another 2 centuries, but it never recovered from 1204. The Fourth Crusade had accomplished what Persians, Arabs, Bulgarians, and Vikings never could. It had broken Byzantium. The irony is almost unbearable. The walls that had protected Constantinople for 800 years still stood. The fortifications were intact, but they'd been defeated by treachery, not siege weapons, by allies, not enemies. The greatest heist in history wasn't just about stolen gold and art. It was about stolen destiny. The Fourth Crusade robbed the Byzantine Empire of its future. And here's the final cruel twist. Many of the treasures stolen from Constantinople ended up fueling the Italian Renaissance. Byzantine art, books, and knowledge enriched Venice, Genoa, and eventually all of Western Europe. The civilization that had preserved ancient wisdom for 1,000 years was plundered, and its treasures were used to build someone else's golden age. Constantinople survived. The empire survived. But after 1204, it was surviving on borrowed time, wounded mortally by those who should have been its defenders. The greatest Christian city, sacked by Christian warriors. The Fourth Crusade remains one of history's most bitter betrayals. Chapter 6. The Scholars Who Saved Western Civilization. While Constantinople burned in 1204, something remarkable was happening in its libraries and scriptoriums. Monks and scholars, watching their world collapse, made a desperate decision. They would save the books. These weren't just any books. They were the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world. Greek philosophy, Roman law, scientific treatises, mathematical proofs, medical texts, poetry, drama, history. Everything that Greece and Rome had created, everything that had survived the fall of the Western Empire, had been preserved in Byzantine libraries for centuries. While Western Europe descended into the Dark Ages, losing most of its classical heritage, Constantinople had kept the flame of learning alive. Now that flame was in danger of being extinguished forever. Byzantine scholars had always seen themselves as guardians of ancient wisdom. They copied manuscripts by hand, generation after generation, ensuring that knowledge passed into the future. They studied Plato and Aristotle as living thinkers, not dusty relics. They debated Homer and Euripides as if these ancient authors were contemporaries. This wasn't nostalgia, it was identity. The Byzantines believed they were Romans, the direct heirs of classical civilization. Preserving ancient texts wasn't optional, it was sacred duty. The great University of Constantinople, founded in 425, had been the intellectual center of the Christian world for centuries. Its libraries held thousands of manuscripts. Its professors taught grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine using texts that dated back to ancient Athens and Alexandria. Students came from across the empire and beyond to study there. The university produced generations of educated administrators, lawyers, doctors, and theologians. It was the institutional memory of classical civilization. But after the Latin conquest of 1204, everything changed. The Latin emperors didn't care about Greek learning. Many manuscripts were destroyed in the sack. Others were scattered. The university declined, and Byzantine scholars began to leave. They went west, carrying books and knowledge with them. Some fled to Nicaea, where a Byzantine government in exile continued. Others went to Italy, particularly Venice and Florence, where wealthy patrons were hungry for classical texts. What happened next changed history. When Byzantine scholars arrived in Italy in the 13th and 14th centuries, they brought something Western Europe had almost completely lost: Greek. The ability to read ancient Greek had virtually disappeared in the West. Latin, yes. But Greek, the language of Aristotle and Plato, of the New Testament and the early Church Fathers, was a mystery. Byzantine scholars could read it fluently. More than that, they possessed original manuscripts of works that existed in the West only as poor Latin translations or not at all. Italian intellectuals, already stirring with new ideas in the early Renaissance, were electrified. Here was direct access to the ancients, unfiltered by centuries of medieval interpretation. One of the most important figures in this transmission was Manuel Chrysoloras, a Byzantine diplomat and scholar who arrived in Florence in 1397. He was invited to teach Greek at the University of Florence, the first time ancient Greek had been taught there in centuries. Chrysoloras brought manuscripts. He brought knowledge, and he trained a generation of Italian humanists who would spark the Renaissance. His students included some of the most influential thinkers of the early 1500s. They learned not just the Greek language, but a way of thinking. The Byzantine scholarly tradition emphasized direct engagement with ancient texts, critical analysis, and the application of classical wisdom to contemporary problems. This method transformed Western thought. Other Byzantine scholars followed. After Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453, the trickle became a flood. Greek intellectuals fled west, carrying whatever books they could save. They became professors, translators, and advisors to Italian princes and popes. They brought Plato's complete dialogues, most of which had been unknown in the West. They brought mathematical texts that revolutionized European understanding of geometry and astronomy. They brought Greek medical treatises that advanced the practice of medicine. Perhaps most importantly, they brought manuscripts of ancient Greek literature and drama. Works by Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Aristophanes that had been lost to the West for centuries suddenly became available again. The printing press, invented around 1450, multiplied the impact. Byzantine texts, copied by hand for 1,000 years, could now be printed and distributed across Europe. Ancient wisdom became accessible to anyone who could read. The irony is profound. The Byzantine Empire, dying slowly after 1204 and finally extinguished in 1453, gave birth to the Renaissance through its death. Western Europe, which had conquered and destroyed Constantinople, inherited its greatest treasure. Not gold or jewels, but knowledge. Byzantine scholars had preserved the intellectual heritage of the ancient world through the darkest centuries of the medieval period. They'd kept learning alive when Western Europe had forgotten how to read Greek. They'd maintained libraries and schools when Western monasteries were focused primarily on prayer and survival. And when their empire finally collapsed, they ensured that the knowledge they'd guarded for so long wouldn't die with them. This is one of history's great unacknowledged debts. The Renaissance, that explosion of art, science, and humanistic thinking that transformed Western civilization was fueled by Byzantine learning. Every time someone in the West read Plato's Republic or Aristotle's Ethics in the original Greek, they were reading texts preserved by Byzantine scribes. Every advance in astronomy built on Ptolemy's work, preserved in Constantinople. Every legal principle derived from Roman law traced back to Justinian's codification. The scholars who saved these books understood something profound. Empires fall. Armies are defeated. Cities are conquered. But ideas, if preserved and transmitted, can outlive any kingdom. Byzantine scribes, working by candlelight in monastery cells, copying ancient manuscripts letter by letter, were performing an act of faith. They believed that knowledge mattered, that the wisdom of the ancients deserved to survive, that future generations would need these texts. They were right. When the last Byzantine emperor died fighting on the walls of Constantinople in 1453, he died defending more than a city. He was defending a 1,000-year tradition of learning and scholarship. That tradition didn't die with him. It migrated west, where it sparked the greatest intellectual revolution in European history. The Byzantine Empire fell, but the civilization it preserved, the books it copied, the knowledge it guarded, survived. And in that survival, Byzantium achieved a kind of immortality. Chapter 7. The Paranoid Palace. Survival through Intrigue. The Great Palace of Constantinople was the most dangerous place in the empire, not because of invading armies or foreign assassins, but because of what happened within its walls. Byzantine politics was a blood sport, and the playing field was the imperial court. For 1,000 years, the palace was the center of Byzantine power. It was where emperors ruled, where laws were made, where the fate of millions was decided. It was also where emperors were murdered, where conspiracies were hatched, and where survival required constant vigilance. If you wanted to understand how Byzantium lasted so long, you had to understand the palace. Because the empire's longevity wasn't just about strong walls and good generals. It was about a political system so complex, so ruthless, and so effective that it could survive almost anything, including its own emperors. Byzantine succession was chaotic. Unlike Western European kingdoms, where the throne usually passed from father to eldest son, Byzantium had no fixed rule. In theory, the emperor was chosen by God. In practice, he was chosen by whoever had enough support from the army, the aristocracy, and the people to seize power. This meant that anyone, theoretically, could become emperor. Generals, bureaucrats, even peasants, if they were clever and ruthless enough. It also meant that emperors were constantly at risk. If you wore the purple imperial robes, you were a target. Rivals plotted. Generals schemed. Even your own family might betray you. The result was a culture of paranoia so intense it became institutionalized. One of the most distinctive features of Byzantine politics was the prominent role of eunuchs, men who had been castrated, either as children or adults, and who served in the palace bureaucracy. To Western Europeans, this seemed bizarre and decadent. But the Byzantines understood the logic. Eunuchs couldn't have legitimate children. They couldn't found dynasties. This made them, in theory, more trustworthy. They had no personal stake in succession struggles. Eunuchs rose to positions of enormous power. They served as chamberlains, controlling access to the emperor. They managed the treasury. They led diplomatic missions. Some even commanded armies. The most powerful eunuchs were among the most influential people in the empire, wielding authority that rivaled generals and aristocrats. This doesn't mean they were trusted. Nothing in Byzantine politics was based on trust. But they occupied a unique position in the complex power structure of the court. Another striking feature of Byzantine politics was the power wielded by women. Imperial women, especially empresses and the emperor's mother, could exercise tremendous influence. Some ruled in their own right. Empress Irene, who restored icon veneration in 787, had her own son blinded to secure her power. She ruled alone as emperor, not empress, from 797 to 802, the only woman in Byzantine history to do so. Empress Theodora, wife of Justinian, was effectively co-ruler. During the Nika riots in 532, When Justinian was ready to flee the city, Theodora stopped him. She declared she would rather die as empress than live as a fugitive. Her courage saved Justinian's throne. Empress Zoe, in the 11th century, outlasted 3 husbands and ruled for decades, becoming one of the longest reigning figures in Byzantine history. These women operated in a male-dominated world, but they found ways to exercise power through intelligence, determination, and political skill. Of course, power came with danger. Byzantine history is filled with empresses who were exiled, imprisoned, or forced into convents when they became inconvenient. The palace itself was designed for intrigue. It was a sprawling complex of halls, gardens, churches, and private apartments. Secret passage connected different sections. Private audiences were held in chambers where hidden alcoves allowed spies to overhear conversations. The emperor's quarters, the sacred palace, was particularly isolated. Access was strictly controlled. Visitors had to pass through multiple checkpoints, each guarded by different units who reported to different commanders. This prevented any single group from staging a coup. The most feared institution in the Byzantine political system was the imperial bureaucracy. The empire was administered by a vast network of officials, secretaries, and clerks who kept meticulous records of everything. This bureaucracy was the empire's institutional memory. Emperors came and went, but the bureaucrats remained. They knew where the money was. They knew the law. They knew how to make the empire function. And they were watching. One particularly Byzantine practice was the art of blinding. When an emperor was overthrown, the winner often didn't kill him. Killing an emperor was regicide, a spiritual crime. Instead, they blinded him. A blinded man couldn't rule, according to Byzantine law. An emperor had to be physically perfect. So blinding was seen as a merciful alternative to execution. It removed the threat without the sin of murder. The practice was horrifying. Hot irons or sharp implements were used. Some victims were completely blinded. Others were partially blinded, just enough to disqualify them from power. Byzantine prisons were full of blinded ex-emperors, living reminders of the price of failure. This culture of intrigue created a strange paradox. The Byzantine political system was incredibly unstable at the top. Emperors were regularly overthrown, murdered, or forced from power. Yet the empire itself remained stable. How? Because the system was larger than any individual. The bureaucracy continued functioning regardless of who sat on the throne. The army remained loyal to the empire, not necessarily to any particular emperor. The church provided spiritual continuity. An emperor could be overthrown Tuesday, and by Wednesday the empire would be operating normally under new management. This resilience was Byzantium's secret weapon. Western kingdoms often collapsed when their kings died without clear heirs. Not Byzantium. The empire just elevated a new emperor and carried on. But this came at a cost. The constant intrigue consumed energy and attention. Talented men spent their lives plotting against rivals instead of fighting external enemies. Paranoia poisoned relationships. The palace was a place where trust was impossible and betrayal was expected, where brothers murdered brothers, where sons blinded fathers, where wives poisoned husbands. It was also a place of incredible sophistication. Court ceremonies were elaborate rituals designed to demonstrate imperial power. When foreign ambassadors visited, they were subjected to carefully choreographed displays intended to awe and intimidate. Mechanical devices made the emperor's throne rise into the air. Golden lions flanking the throne could roar. Mechanical birds sang. The message was clear. The Byzantine emperor was more than human. He was touched by the divine. Yet behind the golden facade was endless scheming. Every smile hid a dagger. Every compliment concealed calculation. The Byzantines themselves were aware of this reputation. Byzantine became synonymous with complexity and intrigue. Byzantine politics meant labyrinthine schemes and hidden agendas, and they were proud of it. In their view, this was sophistication. This was intelligence. Why resolve disputes with crude violence when subtle manipulation could achieve the same result? The paranoid palace was where Byzantium's greatest strength and greatest weakness intersected. The system that allowed the empire to survive countless crises also prevented it from achieving the unity and focus needed to reverse its long decline. Emperors who might have been great reformers were overthrown before they could implement changes. Generals who might have reconquered lost territory were blinded by jealous rivals. The palace consumed the empire from within, slowly, over centuries. But it also kept the empire alive when it should have died. The Byzantine political system, for all its cruelty and chaos, worked. Not well, perhaps, not justly, but it worked, and for 1,000 years, that was enough. Chapter 8. The Slow-Motion Collapse. There's something uniquely tragic about watching a great civilization die slowly, not in a sudden catastrophe, but inch by inch, decade by decade, century by century. Seeing glory fade into memory, watching power slip away despite every desperate effort to hold on. This was Byzantium's fate after the Fourth Crusade. Not a quick death, but a prolonged decline that lasted 2.5 centuries. The empire that had once stretched from Italy to Mesopotamia was slowly, inexorably shrinking. And everyone could see it happening, including the Byzantines themselves. The beginning of the end came in 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert in eastern Anatolia. This was before the Fourth Crusade, but it set the pattern for everything that followed. Emperor Romanos IV had assembled a massive army to push back the Seljuk Turks, who were raiding Byzantine territory in Asia Minor. It should have been a Byzantine victory. They had numbers, they had good positions, they had experience, but the battle was a catastrophe. The Byzantine army was destroyed, the emperor himself was captured, and the defeat opened Anatolia, the heartland of the empire, to Turkish invasion. Anatolia was everything to Byzantium. It provided food, it provided soldiers, it provided taxes. It was where Byzantine power was rooted, and now it was slipping away. Over the following decades, Turkish tribes poured into Anatolia. Byzantine cities that had stood for centuries fell one by one. The local population, faced with constant warfare, sometimes welcomed the Turks as less oppressive than Byzantine tax collectors. The empire asked Western Europe for help. This request led indirectly to the Crusades. And we know how that ended. Instead of helping, the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople. After 1204, the Byzantine Empire was divided into fragments. The Latin Empire held Constantinople. Greek successor states formed in Nicaea, Epirus, and Trebizond, each claiming to be the true continuation of the empire. In 1261, as we discussed, the Nicaean Greeks recaptured Constantinople. The empire was restored, but restoration was an illusion. The city the Byzantines reclaimed was a shadow of its former self. The population had declined from perhaps 500,000 before the Crusade to maybe 50,000. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned ruins. The palaces had been stripped, the churches looted, and the empire's territory was now pathetic. Constantinople and its immediate surroundings, a few cities in Thrace and Macedonia, some territories in southern Greece, a scattering of islands. That was it. That was the Roman Empire in the 13th century. But here's what makes the story so remarkable. Despite having almost nothing, the Byzantines continued to act like an empire. They maintained the full imperial bureaucracy. They performed the ancient ceremonies. They issued decrees as if they still ruled the world. The emperor still sat on his throne, surrounded by elaborate court ritual, even though his empire was smaller than some medieval counties. Foreign observers found it simultaneously dignified and absurd. Here was an emperor with barely any territory, maintaining the fiction of universal sovereignty, but the Byzantines couldn't accept the alternative. To admit they were no longer an empire was to admit that Rome itself had finally died, and that was unthinkable. Throughout the 14th century, the empire continued shrinking. The Ottoman Turks, rising as the dominant power in Anatolia, were the new threat. Unlike the Seljuks, who had been relatively disorganized, the Ottomans were building a centralized state, and their goal was Constantinople itself. The Ottomans conquered Byzantine territories piece by piece. They crossed into Europe in 1352, establishing a foothold in Thrace. Byzantine cities that had resisted Muslim conquest for 700 years now fell to Ottoman forces. By 1400, the empire consisted of Constantinople, a few nearby towns, the city of Thessalonica, and a small territory in southern Greece called the Despotate of the Morea. That was all. The Ottoman capital was established at Adrianople, modern Idion, less than 100 miles from Constantinople. The Byzantines were now surrounded on all sides by Ottoman territory. Constantinople was an island in an Ottoman sea. The emperors desperately sought help from the west. They sent embassies to Rome, to Venice, to Genoa, to any Christian power that might send aid. They even agreed to reunite the Orthodox and Catholic churches, accepting papal authority in exchange for military support. But the help never came. Or when it did, it was too little, too late. Western Europeans had their own problems, and many remembered that the Byzantine Empire had been wealthy and powerful when they'd sacked it in 1204. Now it was poor and weak. What was the point of defending it? The Byzantines also faced internal political chaos. The empire was so small that there was barely anything left to govern, yet the court still erupted in succession disputes and civil wars. Rival claimants to the throne fought each other while Ottoman armies waited outside. It was madness. The empire was dying, and its rulers were still playing the old political games as if nothing had changed. Some Byzantines recognized the reality. Intellectuals and scholars grew pessimistic. They wrote elegies for the empire. They compared Constantinople to Troy, doomed and awaiting its fall. Others remained in denial. They believed God would save them, as he had so many times before. Hadn't Constantinople survived countless sieges? Hadn't the Virgin Mary always protected the city? Surely divine intervention would save them again. But the walls that had protected Constantinople for 1,000 years were slowly deteriorating. The empire couldn't afford proper maintenance. Towers crumbled. Gaps appeared in the fortifications. The great chain across the Golden Horn rusted. The population inside the walls continued to decline. By the 1400s, vast areas of the city were empty. Gardens and fields existed where neighborhoods had once stood. Travelers described Constantinople as a collection of villages separated by ruins. Yet the great buildings still stood. The Hagia Sophia still dominated the skyline, its golden dome visible for miles. The imperial palace still overlooked the sea. The hippodrome still bore the marks of ancient glory. It was a city haunted by its own past. Walking through Constantinople in the 15th century must have felt like moving through a museum of lost greatness. Every street corner held memories of power that no longer existed. The Byzantines clung to hope through ritual and tradition. If they maintained the ceremonies, performed the ancient rites, preserved the imperial protocols, perhaps somehow the empire would revive. Perhaps the glory would return. It wouldn't. The trajectory was clear. Every year, the empire grew weaker. Every year, the Ottomans grew stronger. Everyone knew how this story would end. And yet they persisted. Byzantine diplomats still negotiated as if they had leverage. Byzantine scholars still studied ancient texts. Byzantine priests still prayed in churches that had stood for 1,000 years. There's something heroic about this persistence. Something deeply human. The refusal to surrender, even when defeat was inevitable. By 1450, the Byzantine Empire was essentially just Constantinople and a few square miles around it. The Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, had decided the time had finally come. He would accomplish what generations of Muslim rulers had failed to achieve. He would take Constantinople. The Byzantines knew the end was coming. They could see the Ottoman armies gathering. They could watch the Turks building fortresses on both sides of the Bosphorus, tightening the noose. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, sent final desperate pleas to the West. He offered complete submission to Rome. He promised anything and everything if someone, anyone, would send an army. A few hundred Italian soldiers arrived. That was all. The entire Christian West sent a few hundred men to defend the greatest city in Christendom. Constantine understood what was coming. He'd grown up watching the empire shrink. He'd seen how weak they'd become. He knew the walls were crumbling. He knew his tiny garrison couldn't hold against the massive Ottoman army. But he was emperor, the last emperor of Rome, and he would face what came with dignity. The slow-motion collapse was about to reach its inevitable conclusion. After 1100 years, after countless sieges survived and dangers overcome, Constantinople would finally fall. Not because the Byzantines had lost their courage, not because they'd abandoned their faith, but because history had simply moved on, leaving them behind. The world had changed, and there was no place left for the Roman Empire. The end was coming. Chapter 9. The Last Roman. Constantine Z and the Final Siege. In the spring of 1453, two men prepared for the confrontation that would end an empire. One was Sultan Mehmed, the second of the Ottoman Empire. He was 21 years old, brilliant, ambitious, and obsessed with one goal: taking Constantinople, the city that had defied Muslim conquest for 800 years, the city his father had failed to capture, the city that would make him immortal. The other was Emperor Constantine, the 11th Palaiologos. He was 48, a career soldier who had never expected to become emperor. He'd spent his life fighting hopeless battles to defend Byzantine territory. Now he faced the most hopeless battle of all. These two men, one at the beginning of his glory and one at the end of his, would decide the fate of Constantinople in a siege that the entire world was watching. Mehmed began his preparations months before the siege started. This wouldn't be a simple assault. It would be the most sophisticated military operation of the medieval period. First, he built a fortress on the European side of the Bosphorus, directly across from an earlier Ottoman fortress on the Asian side. Together, these two fortresses could control all shipping through the strait. Constantinople was now completely cut off from the Black Sea and any potential help from that direction. The fortress was built with terrifying speed. Thousands of workers labored through the winter. When Byzantine ambassadors protested that this violated treaties, Mehmed had them executed. The message was clear. Diplomacy was over. Next came the artillery. Mehmed hired a Hungarian engineer named Urban, who claimed he could build the largest cannons ever constructed. Cannons powerful enough to break the Theodosian walls. Urban delivered. He cast enormous bronze cannons, including one monster that was 27 feet long and could fire stone balls weighing over half a ton. It took 60 oxen and hundreds of men to move this weapon. The Byzantines watched these preparations with growing dread. They sent final desperate messages to the west. A few hundred soldiers arrived from Venice and Genoa. The Pope sent a cardinal. That was all. Constantine knew he was facing this alone. Inside Constantinople, the situation was grim. The city's population had dwindled to perhaps 50,000 people, maybe less. The garrison, including the Italian reinforcements, numbered around 7,000 men. Outside the walls, Mehmed assembled an army estimated at 80,000 to 150,000 troops. The numbers are disputed, but everyone agrees the Ottomans had an overwhelming advantage. Constantine did what he could. He organized the defense, assigning sections of the wall to different commanders. The Italian soldiers, experienced professionals, took the most vulnerable positions. Greek troops manned the rest. Every able-bodied man was pressed into service. They repaired the walls as best they could, filling gaps with wood and rubble. They stockpiled stones and arrows. They prayed. The city's great chain was raised across the Golden Horn, preventing Ottoman ships from entering the harbour. It had worked before. Perhaps it would work again. On April 2nd, 1453, the Ottoman army arrived before the walls. The siege had begun. Mehmed positioned his troops all around the landward walls, with his elite janissaries, the professional soldier slaves who formed the core of his army, held in reserve for the final assault. His massive cannons were dragged into position facing the weakest points in the fortifications. When those cannons fired for the first time, the sound was heard miles away. The stone balls smashed into walls that had stood for 1,000 years. Dust and debris exploded into the air, but the walls held. Barely. Each night, Byzantine defenders worked frantically to repair the damage. They piled rubble behind the walls to reinforce them. They built wooden barricades to block the gaps. Every morning, the cannons fired again. The siege settled into a terrible rhythm. Ottoman artillery pounded the walls by day. Byzantine workers repaired them by night. Turkish miners dug tunnels trying to get under the walls. Byzantine counterminers dug their own tunnels to intercept them. Underground battles were fought in darkness, the two sides clashing in narrow earthen passages. On the sea, Ottoman ships blockaded the city but couldn't enter the Golden Horn because of the chain. Then Mehmed pulled off an engineering miracle. He built a road of greased logs over the hill behind the Genoese colony of Galata and rolled his ships over land, bypassing the chain. 70 Ottoman vessels were dragged over the hill and launched into the Golden Horn. The Byzantines watched in disbelief. Their harbour, their protected northern flank, was now threatened. They had to divert precious troops to defend the sea walls. The noose was tightening. Inside the city, morale fluctuated between hope and despair. Religious processions wound through the streets, carrying icons and relics. Priests proclaimed that the Virgin Mary would save them as she had saved the city before. Others saw omens of doom everywhere. The moon entered eclipse during the siege, and some interpreted this as a sign that Constantine's reign would be eclipsed. On May 28th, after 7 weeks of siege, Mehmed announced that the final assault would come the next day. His troops spent the night in prayer and preparation. So did the Byzantines. Constantine XI knew this was the end. He rode along the walls that night, speaking to his men. He thanked the Italian soldiers for their service. He embraced old friends. He asked forgiveness for any wrongs he'd committed. Then he returned to the Church of St. Sophia, the Hagia Sophia, and prayed for the last time. The church was packed with people. For this final moment, the ancient schism between Catholic and Orthodox was forgotten. Everyone prayed together, begging God for a miracle. Constantine spoke to the crowd. According to witnesses, he said he was ready to die for his faith and his people. He asked his subjects to forgive him for failing them. Then he rode back to the walls. Before dawn on May 29th, the assault began. Mehmed threw everything at the walls. Wave after wave of troops advanced through the darkness. First came irregular soldiers, expendable troops meant to exhaust the defenders. Then came better-trained Anatolian soldiers. Finally came the Janissaries, the elite. The fighting was desperate. The Byzantines threw back attack after attack. The Italians fought with professional skill. Constantine himself fought in the thick of battle, sword in hand, leading counterattacks whenever the Turks gained a foothold. But they were too few. There simply weren't enough defenders. Around dawn, disaster struck. The Genoese commander, Giovanni Giustiniani, the most experienced military leader on the Byzantine side, was wounded. He withdrew from the walls to have his wound treated. His soldiers, seeing their commander leave, panicked. They abandoned their posts. A section of the wall was left undefended. Turkish troops poured through. They climbed over rubble and through gaps. The defences were breached. Constantine saw what was happening. He knew the city was lost. He could have fled. Some sources say his friends begged him to escape, to preserve the imperial line. He refused. According to legend, Constantine XI removed his imperial regalia so he wouldn't be recognized. He drew his sword and charged into the mass of Ottoman soldiers, flooding through the breach. He died fighting like a common soldier, the last Roman emperor falling with his city. His body was never definitively identified. By mid-morning, Constantinople had fallen. Ottoman troops swept through the streets. The 3-day sack that followed was brutal but relatively brief. Mehmed, riding through the conquered city, reportedly wept at seeing the ruined state of the once great capital. He converted the Hagia Sophia into a mosque. A wooden minaret was quickly erected. The transformation was immediate and symbolic. The greatest church in Christendom became a Muslim house of worship. The Byzantine Empire, which had endured for 1100 years, was over. News of the fall spread slowly through Europe. When it arrived, it was met with shock and horror. Constantinople, the impregnable city, had fallen. The bulwark against Islam was gone. Christians mourned. Scholars declared it the end of an age. And they were right. Constantine XI died defending something that no longer existed. The world had moved on. The medieval period was ending. The Renaissance was beginning. The age of gunpowder and cannons had made medieval fortifications obsolete. But Constantine died as a Roman. the last emperor of Rome, dying on the walls of Rome's final city, defending civilization itself. In death, he achieved something remarkable. He became a legend. The last Constantine, namesake of the first Constantine who had founded the city, the emperor who chose death over surrender, the man who embodied everything the Byzantine Empire had been: stubborn, proud, faithful, and ultimately tragic. Constantine the 11th Palaiologos, the last Roman, fighting in the breach as his world ended around him. There could have been no more fitting end to the Byzantine story. Chapter 10. The Empire That Never Died. Constantinople fell on May 29th, 1453. The Byzantine Empire was over, but in another sense, it had just begun its second life. Because empires, when they fall, don't simply vanish. They leave echoes. They leave legacies. They leave ideas and institutions that outlive the state itself. Byzantium fell, but Byzantine civilization survived. And in some ways, it's still alive today. The most immediate inheritor was the Ottoman Empire itself. Mehmed II didn't just conquer Constantinople. He claimed the Byzantine legacy. He styled himself Caesar of Rome. He preserved much of the Byzantine administrative system. He appointed the Orthodox Patriarch and allowed the Church to continue functioning. In Mehmed's vision, the Ottoman Empire wasn't replacing Byzantium. It was continuing it under new management. This might seem strange, but it made perfect sense. Constantinople was the greatest city in the region. The Byzantine system of government had worked for centuries. Why discard something that functioned? The Ottomans even preserved some of the palace ceremonies. Ottoman court protocol borrowed heavily from Byzantine tradition. The elaborate hierarchy, the emphasis on ritual, the careful management of imperial access. These were all Byzantine innovations that the Ottomans adapted. But the deeper legacy was religious and cultural. The Orthodox Christian Church, which had been shaped by Byzantine theology for 1,000 years, survived the empire's fall. In fact, it expanded. The Patriarch of Constantinople continued to lead Orthodox Christians throughout the Ottoman Empire. Monasteries continued to function. Theology continued to develop, and Orthodox Christianity spread north. Russia had been converted to Orthodox Christianity by Byzantine missionaries in the 10th century. Russian princes had married Byzantine princesses. Russian churches were built in Byzantine style. Russian religious art followed Byzantine models. When Constantinople fell, Russia saw itself as the natural heir to Byzantine spiritual authority. The Grand Prince of Moscow began calling himself Tsar, the Russian word for Caesar. Moscow was proclaimed the Third Rome, the successor to Constantinople and ultimately to Rome itself. This wasn't just propaganda. Russia genuinely saw itself as carrying on the Byzantine mission of defending Orthodox Christianity. The Russian Orthodox Church maintained Byzantine traditions. Russian iconography followed Byzantine artistic conventions. Even Russian architecture echoed the domes and mosaics of Constantinople. This legacy lasted for centuries. Until the Russian Revolution in 1917, the Russian Empire explicitly claimed Byzantine inheritance. The double-headed eagle, the Byzantine imperial symbol, was Russia's coat of arms. Even today, you can see Byzantine influence throughout Eastern Europe. Orthodox churches in Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, Romania, and Russia all bear the mark of Byzantine architectural and artistic traditions. The iconostasis, that wall of icons separating the altar from the congregation in Orthodox churches, is a Byzantine innovation. The particular style of icon painting, with its flat perspective and golden backgrounds, follows Byzantine conventions established over 1,000 years ago. Walk into any Orthodox church anywhere in the world, and you're experiencing Byzantine civilization. But Byzantium's legacy extended beyond religion. Byzantine law, codified by Justinian in the 6th century, became the foundation for legal systems across Europe. The Code of Justinian was studied in medieval universities. It influenced the development of civil law in France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. Many modern European legal concepts trace directly back to Byzantine jurisprudence. Byzantine art influenced the Italian Renaissance. When Byzantine scholars fled to Italy after Constantinople's fall, they brought not just books, but artistic traditions. The use of perspective, the treatment of religious subjects, the emphasis on classical themes, all of these were transmitted from Byzantium to the West. Even the word Byzantine has entered our language. We use it to describe anything complex, intricate, and labyrinthine. Byzantine politics, Byzantine regulations. We're acknowledging, often without realizing it, the sophisticated administrative culture that Byzantium developed. But perhaps the greatest legacy was the preservation of classical knowledge. As we discussed earlier, Byzantine scholars kept Greek learning alive through the medieval period. When the empire fell, they took that knowledge west. Every modern student who reads Plato or Aristotle in translation is benefiting from Byzantine preservation. Every scientist who builds on Euclidean geometry is using knowledge transmitted through Constantinople. Every doctor who studies Galen's medical texts is accessing wisdom that Byzantium guarded. The Renaissance, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, all of these movements were built on foundations that Byzantium preserved. Western civilization owes an enormous, largely unacknowledged debt to the empire that kept the flame of learning alive through the darkest centuries. Today, you can still visit the physical remnants of Byzantium. The Hagia Sophia still stands in Istanbul, though it's now a museum. Its dome still soars overhead, just as breathtaking as when it was completed in 537. Standing inside, you can feel the weight of history. This building has been a church, a mosque, a museum. It has witnessed the rise and fall of empires. The Theodosian walls still stand, though damaged and incomplete. You can walk along them, touch the stones, and imagine the armies that crashed against them for 8 centuries. In Greece, Byzantine churches and monasteries dot the landscape. The monasteries of Mount Athos, founded in the Byzantine period, still function today, preserving traditions that go back 1,000 years. In Ravenna, Italy, you can see Byzantine mosaics that rival anything in Constantinople. In Venice, the Basilica of San Marco is essentially a Byzantine church, filled with treasures looted from Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade. In museums across Europe, Byzantine art, icons, manuscripts, and artifacts testify to the empire's sophistication. The British Museum, the Louvre, the Vatican museums all hold Byzantine treasures, but perhaps the most important legacy is intangible. It's the idea that civilization can survive catastrophe, that knowledge can outlive empires, that human achievement, if carefully preserved, can transcend the fall of kingdoms. Byzantium survived for 1,100 years in a hostile world. It preserved, created, and transmitted a civilization that shaped the modern world. It proved that adaptability matters more than military might, that institutions can outlast individuals, that culture is more durable than conquest. The Byzantine Empire is gone. No one dreams of restoring it. No one flies its flag or claims its throne. But in Orthodox churches where incense fills the air and icons gaze down from golden walls, Byzantium lives. In legal codes that govern nations, Byzantium lives. In the books we read and the knowledge we've inherited, Byzantium lives. Rome never fell. It transformed. It moved east. It became Greek and Christian. It survived for 1,000 years after the Western Empire collapsed. And when it finally fell, it scattered seeds that grew into new civilizations. The Byzantine Empire was the forgotten empire, overlooked by history books that focused on Western Europe. But it was the bridge between the ancient and modern worlds, the keeper of civilization's flame through the darkest ages. Constantine XI died on the walls of Constantinople, the last Roman emperor defending the last Roman city. But he wasn't defending a dying past. He was defending something eternal. The idea that human civilization matters, that knowledge is sacred, that beauty and learning and faith are worth dying for. That idea didn't die with him. It survived. It flourished. It echoes still. Byzantium fell, but Byzantium endures. The story of the Byzantine Empire is a story of impossible survival, of a civilization that should have died a dozen times over but refused to surrender, of walls that held when they should have fallen, of knowledge preserved when it should have been lost. It's a story of tragedy, too, of glory fading, of power slipping away despite desperate efforts, of an empire that remembered greatness even as it diminished. But most of all, it's a story of legacy. Because empires are measured not by how long they last, but by what they leave behind. And Byzantium left everything. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the forgotten half of Rome, for spending this time exploring an empire that changed the world, yet somehow slipped from memory. I hope you found something here worth remembering. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night.